Opening. The room is silent. A man sits at a small table. Stacks of papers surround him: tax documents, bank records, casino accounts. The man looks ordinary, short, quiet, unremarkable. But for nearly half a century, governments feared him, gangsters respected him, and investigators chased him. His name was Meyer Lansky. He did not rule the streets with violence. He ruled them with numbers. While other gangsters fired guns, Lansky calculated profits. While others fought bloody wars, he built systems: systems of gambling, systems of corruption, systems of money. The American Mafia needed killers, but it also needed something far more dangerous: an accountant. And Meyer Lansky became the brain behind an empire of crime, an empire that stretched from New York to Florida to the glittering casinos of Havana. He helped create the modern mafia. He helped organize crime into a business. But power like that does not last forever, and even the smartest criminal cannot outrun time. This is the story of Meyer Lansky, the man who turned organized crime into an international financial machine. Chapter 1: Origins. Meyer Lansky was not born powerful. He was born poor, very poor. His real name was Meyer Suchovlyansky. He was born in 1902 in Grodno, a city in the Russian Empire. Today it belongs to Belarus. At the time, it was a dangerous place to be Jewish. Poverty was everywhere. Violence was common, and persecution was routine. Lansky's family lived in fear, like thousands of others. They looked toward America, a place that promised opportunity. In 1911, his family arrived in New York. They settled in the Lower East Side, one of the most crowded neighborhoods in the world. Immigrants filled every street: Italians, Irish, Jews, Germans, Polish, each group fighting to survive, and often fighting each other. For young Meyer Lansky, the streets became his classroom. He watched everything: street gangs, protection rackets, small time criminals. He noticed something early: crime was chaotic, violent, unorganized. But it didn't have to be, even as a boy. Lansky showed a strange talent. Numbers fascinated him. He could calculate quickly. He could memorize figures. He understood odds. And on the streets of New York, that talent would become incredibly valuable. As a teenager, he met another young immigrant, a tall Italian named Salvatore Luciano, later known as Lucky Luciano. The two boys came from different backgrounds, but they understood each other. Both were ambitious, both were intelligent, both were ruthless. And together, they began building relationships that would change organized crime forever. But first, they needed to survive the streets. And in New York, survival often meant becoming something dangerous: a gangster. Chapter 2: The Rise. The early 1920s were a perfect environment for crime. In 1920, the United States banned alcohol. Prohibition had begun. Suddenly, millions of Americans wanted something illegal: alcohol. And when demand exists, someone will supply it. For young criminals, prohibition was an opportunity. Lucky Luciano saw the opportunity immediately. But Meyer Lansky saw something deeper. He saw a system: bootlegging, distribution, protection, money laundering. Crime could become a business, and Lansky began building that business. He worked closely with Luciano and another rising gangster, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. The three men became partners. They smuggled alcohol. They ran gambling operations. They built connections across ethnic lines. At the time, most gangs were divided: Italian gangs, Jewish gangs, Irish gangs. They distrusted each other. But Lansky believed cooperation was more profitable than war. He began creating alliances. Jewish gangsters worked with Italian gangsters. Profit became more important than identity. This idea would eventually reshape organized crime. But there was another problem. The old mafia bosses, the traditional leaders, they were old-fashioned, suspicious, violent. They believed in strict ethnic rules, and they resisted change. For Lansky and Luciano, those men stood in the way of a new system, a modern criminal organization, a national network. In 1931, everything changed. A brutal mafia war erupted in New York, the Castellammares War. Two powerful bosses fought for control, Joe Masseria, Salvatore Maranzano. The war was bloody. Assassinations, betrayals, street executions. But behind the scenes, Luciano and Lansky were planning something bigger. They believed the old bosses had to go. The future of organized crime depended on it, and one by one, those old leaders disappeared, killed, betrayed, replaced. When the war ended, Luciano reorganized the mafia. 5 crime families, a national commission, a system of cooperation. But behind Luciano's vision stood Meyer Lansky, quiet, calculating, designing the financial structure of the American underworld. Violence built the empire, but money would sustain it, and Lansky understood money better than anyone. Chapter 3: The Empire. By the 1940s, Meyer Lansky had become one of the most powerful men in organized crime, but unlike other gangsters, his power was invisible. He avoided publicity. He avoided attention. He dressed like a businessman, not a gangster. His real weapon was financial intelligence. Lansky understood something that many criminals ignored. Illegal money must eventually become legal, and that required creativity. He built networks of casinos, gambling operations, offshore accounts. Money moved quietly through his system, from New York to Miami, from Miami to Cuba. Cuba became the crown jewel. In the 1950s, Havana was transforming. Luxury hotels, casinos, nightclubs, American tourists, and behind much of that development stood Meyer Lansky. Working closely with Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista, Lansky helped finance enormous casino resorts, the Riviera, the Nacional, the Tropicana. Money flowed through Havana, millions of dollars, gamblers, celebrities, politicians. To many visitors, Havana looked glamorous, bright lights, champagne, music. But behind the glamour, the system was simple. The house always wins, and the house belonged to Lansky. He became known as the mob's accountant, a nickname that perfectly captured his role. He wasn't the most violent gangster, but he was the most financially sophisticated, and that made him incredibly dangerous. Law enforcement struggled to catch him. They suspected everything, but proving it was another matter. Lansky rarely left evidence. He rarely spoke carelessly, and his businesses often looked legitimate. Casinos, hotels, real estate. The empire continued growing, but history has a way of disrupting even the most carefully designed plans. And in 1959, the world changed. In Cuba, a revolution had begun, led by a man named Fidel Castro, and for Meyer Lansky, that revolution would destroy his greatest investment, almost overnight. Chapter 4: Cracks in the System. When Fidel Castro seized power in 1959, everything changed. The glamorous casinos of Havana suddenly became symbols of corruption, symbols of foreign influence, symbols of organized crime. And Castro moved quickly. The casinos were shut down. The hotels were seized. Foreign investors were expelled. For Lansky, the losses were enormous. Millions of dollars disappeared. Years of planning collapsed. But this was only the beginning of his problems. Back in the United States, law enforcement had started paying closer attention to organized crime. For decades, Many politicians denied the mafia even existed, but by the 1950s, the evidence was impossible to ignore. Public hearings began, Senate investigations, television broadcasts. Americans watched as mob leaders were questioned under oath. The government wanted answers, and Meyer Lansky's name appeared again and again. Investigators suspected he controlled vast financial networks, gambling, money laundering, international transactions, but proving it remained difficult. Lansky rarely touched the operations directly. He stayed behind the curtain, yet pressure continued building. Federal agents followed him. Investigators examined his finances. Journalists wrote stories. The invisible accountant was slowly becoming visible, and visibility was dangerous. By the late 1960s, the government was preparing new strategies: tax charges, financial investigations, international warrants. They might not prove every crime, but they could still bring him down. And Lansky understood something important. His time in America might be ending. Chapter 5: The Fall. In 1970, Meyer Lansky made a desperate decision. He fled the United States. His destination was Israel. He hoped to claim citizenship under the law of return, a law that allowed Jews to immigrate and become citizens. For Lansky, Israel seemed like a safe refuge, a place beyond the reach of American prosecutors. But the situation was complicated. Israeli authorities faced enormous pressure. The United States wanted Lansky extradited, and Israeli leaders worried about becoming a sanctuary for organized crime. After long debates, the decision was made. Israel refused his request. Lansky would not be allowed to stay. In 1972, he was deported back to the United States. The aging gangster returned to face trial. Federal prosecutors charged him with tax evasion. They believed his hidden fortune was enormous, hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps more, but proving it was another matter. Lansky's finances were incredibly complex: shell companies, offshore accounts, hidden investments. The trial dragged on. Witnesses testified, evidence was examined, and finally, in 1974, the verdict came: not guilty. After decades of investigation, the government had failed to convict him. Meyer Lansky walked free, but freedom looked very different now. He was older, sick, weakened by time. The powerful empire he once influenced had changed. New leaders had taken control. The world of organized crime was evolving. And Lansky, once the mastermind behind the financial system of the mafia, was becoming a relic of another era. Finale. Meyer Lansky died in 1983 in Miami Beach. He was 80 years old. The government believed he had once controlled a fortune worth hundreds of millions, but when he died, his estate appeared surprisingly small. Some investigators believed the money was still hidden somewhere. Secret accounts, unknown investments, lost forever. Others believed the fortune had been exaggerated, a myth created by decades of speculation. But the real legacy of Meyer Lansky was not money, it was structure. He helped transform organized crime from chaotic street gangs into an organized business network. He introduced accounting to crime, strategy to violence, systems to corruption. The mafia did not become powerful by accident. It became powerful through planning, through intelligence, through people like Lansky, men who understood that power does not always appear violent. Sometimes it appears quiet, calculated, invisible. And perhaps the most disturbing question remains this: if one quiet man with a talent for numbers could help build a criminal empire, how many other empires operate the same way today, hidden, organized, and waiting in the shadows?